a quick video on larynx. I don't have any current larynxes at the place where I work. We just don't have that much ENT. But I was asked to do a larynx video, and I actually have a larynx lecture that I did several years ago. So I'm just going to run through the quick slides of that. Most of the larynx, the hard part is the anatomy. So I'm going to talk a lot about landmarks, the anatomy, and then of course I'll show you some pictures of examples of larynxes. And what makes larynx so difficult is the fact that the lesions can be in multiple different areas. And I'm also going to break down the CAP Synoptic reporting checklist for the gross part only, just so you know what needs to be in the gross and the questions that need to be answered by the pathologist after you've grossed it, so you know what to do. So that being said, larynx, okay, we have three important functions: control of airflow during breathing, protection of the airways, and production of sound for speech. The main part of the framework of the larynx is made out of the thyroid cartilage. The larynx rests on the rings-shaped cricoid cartilage, and below this is the trachea. Above, attached by ligaments, is the larynx, is the front of the U-shaped bone of the hyoid bone, and this provides support and moves upwards with the larynx during swallowing and the tongue. Okay, so the basic anatomy. So this is a larynx with the back cut off. So we're looking at the inside of the front. So this is the epiglottis, the hyoid bone, usually attached to some soft tissue only, is floating. Then we get into the thyroid cartilage, which only runs along the front of the larynx. And then let's keep going down. The cricoid cartilage, this makes a complete ring around the front and the back. And I'll show you some examples of that. And then, of course, you get down to the tracheal rings and the trachea. Now, inside, what we have are the top vocal cords, all the false cords, and then the space between is the ventricles, and then the bottom vocal cords are the true cords. Here's another section of this showing a side view. Okay, again, we have the hyoid bone, the epiglottis coming up. The aryepiglottic fold is this little crease. The cricoid bone is here. I'm sorry, the arytenoid cartilage is here. The cricoid is down here. And again, look how the cricoid will actually wrap all the way around. Okay, the thyroid is just on the anterior side. So you do not see thyroid on the back. This is arytenoid. And of course you have your false cord, your true cord, and then in the middle is your ventricle. All right, so moving on. We're going to gross this larynx. What do we want to know? What are the important landmarks we need to know? If you know where each of these things are located in the larynx, then you should have no problem grossing it, okay? So the right and left piriform sinuses. I'll show you pictures of that. The right and left aryepiglottic folds. I'll show you pictures of that. The epiglottis. These are zones. So you have supraglottis, glottis, and subglottis. These are different zones in the larynx based on landmarks. So if you know where the true cord, the false cord, the ventricle, then you know where the supraglottis, glottis, and subglottis are. Okay, this is important because when we go through the CAP synoptic reporting, these zones are going to be important for tumor extension. Where's the false cord, true cord, ventricles, okay, anterior and posterior commissures, okay, thyroid cartilage, we talked about that, and the cricoid cartilage. If you know where all these landmarks are, grossing a larynx should be pretty straightforward. Okay, so how are we going to approach this larynx? We're going to measure, okay, measure in 3 dimensions, just like most specimens, okay? Describe what we see, what is present, okay? So is this a total laryngectomy, a partial laryngectomy? And describe what else is attached. Oftentimes you'll get thyroid lobes, you'll get neck dissections, you'll get a piece of tongue, and how much soft tissue. Sometimes you'll get actually a tracheostomy with skin on the front. So describe what we have. And this will become important when I talk about the CAP synoptic reporting, because this is what needs to be said about how much we have. Ink the exposed soft tissue surfaces along the anterior and posterior aspect. I'll show you how to do that. Open the larynx posteriorly using scissors. Okay, so we're going to cut it open from the back, and then we're going to break it open. So we're going to basically break the cricoid cartilage ring that's along, remember how that wraps all the way around, just so we can visualize the inside of the larynx. So we can figure out where the lesion is, how big the lesion is, how far the lesion is from the margins. This is a very important step. Okay, and then of course we use our thumb to break it open, and a picture says 1,000 words. Okay, so you can describe as much as you want, but if the pathologist doesn't understand what you're saying, show them the picture. Okay, so we're grossing still. Mass, size, shape, location. Is it unifocal or is it multifocal? In my experience, most of them have been unifocal, but I guess you could get into a multifocal, at least superficial spreading around in the larynx. So is it located supraglottis, glottis, or subglottis, or does it span all three different zones? Does the lesion extend into the piriform sinus? Does it cross the anterior or posterior commissures? Is it mainly located on the right or is it located on the left? Proximal and distal margins. How far is it from these margins? How far is it from the soft tissue resection margin, both anterior and posterior? If you have that tumor that's extending into the soft tissue, how far is it from that margin? And is the tumor extending into the thyroid cartilage or cricoid cartilage? Okay, and so obviously if the mass is extending into these bones, you need to decal that section. Okay, so sections. Here are my sections for a laryngectomy. Okay, first I do the entire proximal soft tissue margin. That is the entire superior mucosal margin, 360 degrees. I typically start anterior 12 o'clock and march around in a clockwise fashion, submit it in 4 or 5 cassettes, depends on how big it is. The tracheal margin, which is that distal margin, and obviously has cartilage and stuff, so just take that whole thing on FOSS. So, and then this is the next thing, the mass to the surrounding tissue. Okay, so where's the mass at? And so is the mass extending into the arytenoid fold? Is it extending into the bone? So this is where you get your mass extending two sections. Okay. If the mass is extending in to involve the anterior commissure, then I won't submit the anterior commissure in addition to. Obviously, this is only if it's not involving the entire glottis, okay, on both sides involving. So typically what I'll do is I'll submit sections. So if the tumor is away from the glottis, which includes the false chord, true chord, and ventricle section, I will submit that section in addition to. So if the mass is involving those, obviously that's already been submitted, but if the mass isn't involving it, I'll submit that. The air epiglottic folds into piriform sinuses on both sides if not involved. Again, if the tumor was involving it, I've already put in the entire tumor. So those things would be gone if they were involved. If they're not involved, I submit a representative sections. A section of the epiglottis every time. Thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage if involved. I do not submit a piece of thyroid cartilage or cricoid cartilage if they are uninvolved. I think it's a worthless section. If the tumor is superficial, not extending into those underlying cartilage and bones, I don't submit it. But if it is, obviously I would have put that in with the mass. Anterior soft tissue margin, which is typically the closest soft tissue margin from the deepest area of invasion from the tumor. And any additional structures. You'll often get thyroid with these, neck dissections, a piece of tongue, so submit those sections also. Okay, so let's break into the Larynx CAP Synoptic checklist. Okay, so these are the checklists that the pathologist is looking at the next day after you've signed this out, or after you've already grossed it, so they can sign it out. Okay, so these are the questions I need to answer. This is why we've done what we've done as far as the grossing goes. Okay, what do we have? Do we have a transoral laser excision, which is basically a small piece of tissue where they've gone in there with a laser and cut it off? Do we have a supraglottic laryngectomy? That's a partial laryngectomy that's only located above the false chord. A supracricoid laryngectomy, a vertical hemilaryngectomy. So it could typically be a right or a left, where they basically go in and they get the supraglottic, glottic, subglottic from the affected area, leaving the other side unaffected. Is it a partial laryngectomy? Again, you can get some variations of what we've talked about, but for the most part, what I'm going to talk about are total laryngectomies. This is typically the most common. And then, of course, did we get a neck dissection and all that? So tumor site, okay, so this is where we're going to talk about our landmarks. This is how in the gross where we talked about where the tumor was located, which zone was it located, what landmark was involved by the tumor, okay? We can just mark down this. Now this says plus, okay? So this can involve every one of these things because tumors can be very extensive. So you got to let them know where the tumor is. So is it involving the false chord, is it the arytenoids, the aryepiglottic folds, the epiglottis, the anterior commissure, the posterior commissure. So this is where in your gross you need to have, is any of these structures involved? And if they're not involved, you need to say they are not involved. Okay, and so continuing on with the synoptic checklist, transglottic extension. Is it going through the glottis? Laterality, is it right, left, midline? Obviously, we've talked about that. Is it unifocal or multifocal? And then, of course, the dimensions of the mass. Sometimes these things are very hard to say. What I've found is I typically give a two-dimensional measurement on the surface, then after I section into it, I do a third dimension because it can sometimes be much bigger after you've sectioned it because it kind of spreads underneath the mucosa. Okay, and so these are just some pictures from a Ruban grossing manual that I snipped out. I like these. These drawings are really nice. However, you will not see a larynx that looks just like this. This is too perfect. But for the most part, this is what we're going to do with the landmarks. Okay, so what we have here is the hyoid bone, which wraps around the front of the epiglottis. This ridge here is the piriform sinus. It sits in there. The aryepiglottic fold is this crease that's leading to the piriform sinus. This is supposed to be the cricoid, or sorry, the thyroid cartilage that wraps around the front. And so what they've done here is they've inked this soft tissue. And so remember I talked about my first section, I'll do 360 degrees of that superior mucosal resection margin. So this is what I'm talking about. There's this little rim of mucosa that runs the entire superior edge. I would grab this little edge right here using scissors and lay them in a cassette, and that'll be my superior margin. And then of course this is my tracheal margin, my distal margin. Again, more of the Rubans. Epiglottis, a little bit of tongue, a little bit of hyoid. Okay, here's our thyroid cartilage and our cricoid cartilage. Remember, the cricoid wraps all the way around. The arytenoid cartilage is here. Okay, so, but what I like about this is this breaks down the zones. Remember the zones we were talking about? Okay, so supraglottis, glottis, subglottis. These are the zones. So everything superior of the false chord is considered supraglottis. Everything from the false chord down to the bottom of the true chord is the glottis. So that includes the ventricle and true chord. Then everything inferior of the true chord is considered the subglottis. Okay, again, this is a different angle, same deal. Okay, here's what we have. We have our piriform sinus, we have our aryepiglottic fold, we got our arytenoid cartilage, we got our cricoid cartilage. Here's our supraglottis, everything superior of the false chord. Our glottis is our ventricle and true chord, and then everything inferior of the true chord is the subglottis. I like this section here. Okay, this is that supraglottis, glottis, subglottis section. Okay, very nice section. Obviously, there's no tumor here, and I'm about to show you some pictures of things that get real, which look nothing like these beautiful drawings. Okay, this is a laryngectomy. Looks like I did it back in 2008. I have it broken open, opened it from the posterior. Here's our cricoid cartilage. Here's our arytenoid cartilage. Here is our horn of the thyroid cartilage. Okay, epiglottis, aryepiglottic fold, and this is real tumor. Okay, this is our ventricle, false chord, true chord, and it's kind of hard to see, but this is tumor. Let me zoom in a bit. It's kind of fuzzy, but you can kind of appreciate the tumor in the middle. Don't look at this around the outside. So what we have is a ulcerative lesion extending from the glottis into the subglottis that's involving the anterior commissure, both right and left. Okay, and it's so far from the superior mucosal margin, and it's so far from the distal tracheal resection margin. Sectioning through the mass reveals a tan yellow granular cut surface that extends to the underlying thyroid cartilage and is so far from the anterior soft tissue margin. Okay, just to give you a brief synopsis, we're telling them how big it is, where it's located, how far it is from the margins, and what's it involving. Okay, here's another example. And you can see this thing's got a lot of attached soft tissue, most likely a left thyroid lobe attached as well, okay? And you can see there's a lot of action here. This guy had a tracheostomy put in, so you can see he was using this to breathe. Okay, again, here we're open along the posterior side. We're looking at the inside of the larynx. Here's our epiglottis, our epiglottic fold, arytenoid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. Here's our lesion. Our lesion is located on the left, extending from the supraglottis to, I would say, into the subglottis. Okay, so the false chord over here is way up here, and so tumor is below that. So it goes from supraglottis, glottis to subglottis. It is approaching and involving the anterior commissure, mainly on the left, but extending to the right. It is so far from the superior mucosal margin. It is so far from the distal tracheal resection margin. The mass is encroaching upon the left aryepiglottic fold. Okay. See, I have a zoomed in picture of this. Okay, so you can see this better. Okay, so remember our anatomy. Okay, our false chord involved, our supraglottis involved, our glottis involved on the left, our subglottis involved on the left, and our anterior commissure is involved. All right, here's another one. I like this example because this is what makes larynx so funny, is the lesions will not be in the same place every time. And so how you handle it will vary based on where the lesion is located. This lesion is not in the larynx at all. It is in the aryepiglottic fold, not in the formal larynx. So here I am. I'm zoomed in. You can see this nasty looking, gritty, hemorrhagic, friable squamous cell carcinoma arising in the left aryepiglottic space that's very close to this superior mucosal resection margin. You can see here I've actually already removed this mucosal margin. You can see there's no ink right here. It's because I've already snipped it off with the scissors before I took the picture. Our epiglottis. Here I'm going to open up the larynx and you'll see the inside is perfectly fine. Well, it's not fine, but it's not, there's no lesion inside here. So here we have our arytenoid cartilage here. Here's our false chord, our ventricle, and our true chord. Here's our anterior commissure. So the lesion is entirely in the left aryepiglottic space. Okay, here's another one. Obviously, we have a radical neck dissection here on the right side. I've already opened it, but I'm not opening it here. I'm just showing you the overall specimen. The tumor is clearly inside here. Here's our aryepiglottic folds, epiglottis. We actually have hyoid bone on this one. Let's zoom in. Okay, so we can see there is this massive ulcerative mass extending from the supraglottis, glottis, approaching the subglottis. It's kind of debatable. You know, you can see that true chord is right there. It could be involving the left for sure. Anterior commissure is definitely involved. The mass looks like it's very deep. I don't have any cut sections of that mass to the cricoid or the thyroid cartilage, but use a bone saw. It's typically what I'll do because a lot of these older individuals, their cartilage is no longer cartilage, it's actually bone, and it's very hard, so I'll use that to get good sections of tumor to bone. Here's another one. You can tell this one's fresh. We actually have a right thyroid lobe attached here. They took the right thyroid lobe because they felt like it could be involved because the lesion is primarily on the right. Okay. This one is going from the supraglottis, glottis, and subglottis on the right, involving the anterior commissure. You know, and so describe the mass. I would describe this as slightly raised, centrally ulcerated, a granular mass. I mean, it is what it, and as you can see here, he's got a previous tracheostomy done here. Again, we have hyoid bone that kind of wraps around the front. And here's a zoomed in picture of that same one. So you can see the slightly raised granular mass, mainly on the right, involving the anterior commissure, going from the supraglottis to the subglottis. It is so far from the right aryepiglottic fold. It is so far from the left aryepiglottic fold. It is so far from the superior mucosal margin. It is so far from the distal tracheal margin. That's basically how I would handle the laryngectomy.